On climate, for instance, what we did here was to essentially analyze the, let's say, the evolution of the aridity index as a result of climate change, looking at medium to longer term scenarios. So this is an average for the decade 2040 to 2050. And what we found is essentially that in some of the drier scenarios, the extent of drought itself might actually increase up to 20% overall, with actually much larger increases in some countries. So in other words, not only droughts might be more frequent and so on, but the area itself that can be considered drylands might become larger in the future, so posing additional challenges to development programs and development strategies that we will be designing in the future. So the way in which we kind of looked at the way in which we're trying to kind of come up with a single metric is to look at the people that are vulnerable, so people that are living drylands or are exposed, people that are sensitive to drought, so people that rely on farming or livestock or mixed activities for their income. And people that are unable to cope as a result of being below the poverty line. Out of that, essentially, with let's say modeling calibrated and validated based on the last 20 years of evidence, working in cooperation with ARC and WFP and FAO, essentially we came up with an estimate of the number of people that, in addition to be vulnerable, actually hit by droughts on any given average year. And so that's our starting point in 2010, which is our initial year. We then looked at a range of scenarios of economic transformation that reflects the fact that although not as fast as we would have liked, but countries will grow in terms of income and income per capita. Combined with population growth, of course, that will determine the overall, say, prospects for the future. And I don't have time now to get into the details, but we looked at essentially the way in which any given rate of GDP growth will affect poverty reduction, looking at the elasticity of poverty reduction as a result, as a function of per capita income and so on. Bottom line, essentially, if you make it equal to 100, the number of people that are vulnerable to drought shock in any given year, we came up with essentially with a range of possible evolution of that figure. And the red dots are essentially the main scenarios that we have utilized for the rest of the analysis. That kind of uses the average rate of growth experience over 20-year spells in the historical record, and a conservative assumption on the rate of let's say the elasticity of poverty reduction to per capita income. And bottom line, as you can see, many of the countries, both in East and West Africa, tend to be above the 100% line, which means that in absolute number, the number of people vulnerable to drought and therefore potentially affected by drought will be higher, and in some cases very much higher than in 2010. So big challenges ahead. That's the main message of this slide after this long introduction. So basically, it's in order to kind of come up with a range of interventions that will address the problem. And what we did, essentially, we identify a subset of interventions out of the many that are possible to consider, that are applicable in different ways depending on the degree of aridity of the areas that we're looking at. And so that's the kind of the gradient of the color in these slides. And so we looked essentially at four main areas. We looked at support to pastoralist livelihoods. We looked at irrigation. We looked at ways to make rainfed agriculture more productive, and we looked at tree-based system. In addition to that, there were other interventions, more of a cross-cutting nature, where we kind of looked at the potential additional gains, although not in every case we looked at that in a quantitative way. So let me go through some of these areas for potential intervention in some detail. So livestock, clearly it's one of the most important one. A lot of the problem of vulnerability have to do with pastoral livelihood. So we spend quite a bit of time, and again, I'd like to acknowledge the very strong contribution provided by FAO in this part of the analysis. And again, I would invite all of you who are interested in looking at not just at the synthesis reports, but at the background paper that contains a lot of the technical detail that I won't be able to illustrate now. So here, you'll see here some of the main insights. What we did essentially is for the pastoralists to identify three groups. This is related to the essentially the let's say the access to the minimum number of TLUs, or tropical livestock units, so the size of the herd that would be necessary to kind of withstand climate variability over 20 years time horizon. And essentially, as you can see in these slides, as a result of population growth and the kind of limited ability essentially to access the grazing area that are needed to have the herd survive, what we project is that there will be a strong tendency, as I mentioned initially, to kind of either remain vulnerable to shocks or actually to drop out of the system altogether. But if selective interventions are considered, particularly improving animal health through improved veterinary services, as well as early offtake of male animals to kind of move the animals away from the driest area, making them, helping pastoralists sell these animals quicker and so on. The share of people that are likely to be, affected by these trends, so either being pushed out of the system or remain vulnerable, is decreasing. Now, it's not decreasing as much as we would like in relative terms, particularly in the drier area of the pastoral livelihoods, but they're decreasing in an important way. We're talking about millions of people made more resilient in absolute terms. And the scope for successful intervention seems to be higher in the agro-pastoral areas, so which are the slightly less dry areas in the country. But the main message here is that, and again, I'm already kind of anticipating some of the key messages that I'll try to summarize at the end. We need to think about a wider range of intervention. We can do some important difference with improved animal health and early animal offtake, but we need also to kind of think about additional interventions that are moving up the blue bars, which is the share of population made resilient over this kind of 20 years of simulation period, by, for instance, providing improved access to non-livestock income, by essentially improving the access to common grazing areas, and by essentially promoting somehow a less unequal distribution of animal wealth. I mean, one of the main challenges we face now in these areas is that although the statistics are quite limited, but what we can see in the available numbers is there is a lot of people, so there is a lot of animals in the hands of few people, and a lot of people with very few animals. So that poses huge challenges for kind of having livelihoods that depends primarily on livestock in all of the 20 years on any given climatic cycle. So that's a big challenge to be recognized. Let me move on to the second set of interventions, irrigation. There is a lot of interest in the ability of irrigation to make the situation better. Intuitively, aridity is about lack of water, so why don't we kind of come up with ways to make it more water available to irrigation. So we looked, working closely with IFPRI, we looked at a detailed model of, let's say, potential for irrigation expansion in drylands, both in terms of small-scale irrigation as well as larger-scale irrigation based on dams and reservoirs. And the analysis was carried out essentially looking at the, let's say, the hydrological aspect of it, so where the water might come from, where it might be collected from rivers, from dams, and so on, but also looking, importantly, at the market viability. So Essentially, it was conducted on a pixel by pixel basis, and all the pixels where the technical assessment indicated a potential for irrigation development. We also looked at the potential for actually bringing the additional production on the market and making a decent profit that would pay back the investment in irrigation. And we used a range of IRR, internal rate of return, to assess the financial viability. So using like a conservative 12% IRR and let's say, moderate assumption on cost, we essentially came up with this map, and of course there are more details in the report, that essentially identifying the areas where irrigation might be not only technically viable, but also financially viable. And of course, we're talking about a significant potential increase in the area, up to 4 times what we have now across the drylands. But there is an important potential but, which is that most of the potential seems to lie in the areas that are in fact less arid. So here the potential is expressed as a percentage of the total cropland as it is now, and as you can see, depending on the assumption, we have a bracket, right, which is determined by the assumption on the let's say target rate of return. As you can see, the more arid areas of the drylands, the potential is to increase irrigation for over land area equivalent to about between 2 and 3%. So it's something, but clearly it's not going to make a lot of difference. The potential seems to be higher as we move into less dry area, and then of course this is not really surprising because this is where more water tends to be available throughout the year, and this is where also the production of the additional crops might be more viable from a financial point of view. We looked, of course, then at the whole rainfed crops, right? So it's not just about irrigation, but it's also to make rainfed crops more productive and more viable. We looked again at a subset of interventions, although there is more discussion in more qualitative terms in the report, also at other ones. But essentially, we looked at improved varieties in terms of drought tolerance and heat tolerant germplasm. We looked at the way to improve the soil fertility management through chemical and natural fertilizers, and we looked at combined interventions, kind of different mixes of the two. And the metric that we used is what I mentioned earlier. So this is a model-based estimate of the number of drought-affected people, and by drought-affected I mean people that are essentially subsistence farmers. Let's say being affected by drought is determined by when, given certain climatic conditions, the yields drop below a certain threshold level. And below a certain threshold level, essentially the production is not able to support the family, and so there is a drought impact on these groups. So when we consider these interventions in these 6 categories that I mentioned, we can see that the number of drought-affected people compared to the do-nothing scenario actually decreases. Here, actually, we have the reduction. So there is quite a bit of overall reduction in the range of 20% overall, with higher opportunities in countries like Ethiopia and Senegal. So there is already something that important that we can do. Some countries less, some countries more. What is interesting is that when we combine it, we don't just look at the crop aspects of the problem, but we also look at already looking more at the rest of the landscape. And so when we combine purely farming interventions with improved management of trees, here we focus particularly on farm managed natural regeneration. We can see that the potential of reducing the number of drought-affected people considerably increases, particularly if in systems where high density of trees can be promoted. Finally, we looked at ways in which, I already alluded to, look at other kind of cross-cutting interventions. Here, the analysis was more of a qualitative nature, looking at ways in which, looking at, let's say, putting together this information, this intervention, looking at landscape approach, can provide additional opportunity for the famous multiple wins. So there is a good discussion in the report about that. We looked also at the potential for let's say, improving the functioning of markets so that foods and critical, let's say, produce can be moved more quickly from within the regions, and so the interventions were both of, let's say, infrastructural nature, looking at improved roads, but also removing, let's say, non-physical barriers to movement of goods and services. So here there is an important set of interventions that can be considered there. But we also recognize that not all of the risk can be eliminated. So clearly there is a very important part of the analysis that looks at the how do we deliver the assistance to the population that is still, after all these interventions, not able to kind of cope with the drought. And clearly, the first insight is widely accepted, but I think it's important to emphasize is that investing in social safety nets can deliver the same or improved amount of support at much lower cost and much quicker. So that's the key message here that kind of compares the average cost of a humanitarian response to the cost of safety nets in different regions of reality. But clearly, we also have to recognize that the cost, while there's going to be saving compared to the humanitarian response, the cost is not going to come cheap. So here, what we did is to basically estimate the cost of on any given year, considering the amount of people that will be affected by drought, what would be the cost of bringing these people up to the poverty line. And if we want to have like a full kind of closing of the poverty gap, we're talking about interventions that tend to be above the 1% of GDP, let's say, normative threshold that is typically used in discussion on the valuability of safety nets. So big challenges from the financial point, from the fiscal point of view as well. So here's the kind of the I'm almost done, but I want to spend just a few minutes on some of the key messages. So here's one key slide, right, that brings together some of the main findings of the analysis. So again, the 100 blue line is normalized 2010, is the number of people that on an average year are affected by droughts across different countries. And the blue dots indicate the increase in that number of drought-affected people in the business as usual, do nothing scenario. So we tend to see fairly large increases and therefore a strong case for intervention. The red dots are essentially the number of drought-affected people once we put in place interventions that I tried to describe earlier, also taking into account the need to kind of come up with a country-specific optimal combination of this intervention that tend to vary from country to country. And as you can see, there is a wide potential for really bringing significantly down the blue dots further down towards the 100%. In a few cases, even actually doing better. So therefore, not only reducing the damage, but also actually improving upon the situation that we've seen in the reference year 2010, and therefore to actually reduce the number of people affected by drought. So that's one of the key messages of the analysis. The second one I alluded to earlier is that clearly countries have to do their homework, so to speak, and so is the development community working them. There is no single silver bullet. So the mix of interventions that are able to kind of mitigate the problem varies considerably from country to country. So here, making equal to 100 the number of people that can be, let's say, protected and sheltered from drought, the contribution of different interventions between, let's say, between drought resilience and heat resilient varieties and irrigation and agroforestry and so on, the mix varies considerably from country to country. So clearly there is a big let's say, message for kind of coming up with priorities that are country and even specific at the subnational level. The other key findings links essentially the let's say the resilience side of the story with the social protection side of the story. If we invest in these interventions, essentially we will have less people than on any given year will have to be supported by safety nets. And that will essentially generate a net saving for governments. And this kind of dividends, what we call it is the resilience dividend, can be reinvested by government into making more people more resilient. So clearly there is a strong rationale for kind of linking let's say the longer term interventions in making the livestock and farming more resilient to the ability to generate more resources that will be saved and not need to be invested in safety nets. So let me just move to the final kind of take-home messages. So if we started off from a picture of vulnerability that we see in 2010 and we project it to be deteriorating quite significantly in 2030, there are essentially three pathways out of that situation. One is to invest in existing livelihoods, and our analysis suggests that essentially we can cut in half or more, depending on the country, the increase in people that might be vulnerable to drought. The second one is to strengthen safety nets, recognizing that this will be, in any case, a very important component of the strategy. But also we have to be mindful of the fact that we cannot improve the productivity of existing livelihoods everywhere. We cannot necessarily have safety nets that can deliver support to everyone. So we have to think about alternative options, and that's a little bit the unfinished agenda that we flagged at the end of the report as an important area for the development community to look at. And let me just go to the final slide. The three items of this unfinished agenda are: one, landscape restoration. I just came back a couple of weeks ago from the Great Green Wall initiative that, as you're familiar with, is trying to essentially to kind of create a corridor of kind of improved tree plantation and landscape management from the Sahel to Djibouti. And clearly that's a very important agenda for the future. So looking beyond the traditional interventions that we'll be looking at, what is the economic case and the social case for investing in landscape restoration. The other one is alternative livelihoods. So we need to kind of look more broadly at ways in which some of the population of the future for drylands can be offered additional opportunity outside of dryland and outside of traditional livelihoods. And then the third one is that recognize that particularly with climate change there might be more severe, more frequent shocks. We have to come up with improved kind of financial instruments to deal with those shocks, particularly when the existing domestically financed safety nets are unable to kind of deal with the shocks. So let me stop here and I guess turn it over to the chair for comments and follow-up.